So welcome everyone. We're going to start with this question in the chat, which I'll paste there in a moment. We're curious as we get started tonight, what's on your mind as the biggest issues that when it comes to writing instruction that you see in the schools where you work? And please, if you're comfortable, share a bit about your context as well. And we will do some housekeeping and then we'll dive in. So starting with introductions, my name is Sherry Lewkowicz. I'm the Senior Director of the Writing Pathway. I come from a background teaching high school English, taught high school English for 8 years in the Bronx. And since then, I've been at a number of nonprofits focused on writing instruction for quite a while now. And very, very excited tonight to introduce you to 3 educators who've been using the pathway. And I will start by passing it to Laura Asher. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Laura Asher. This is my 5th year teaching. I currently teach 8th grade ELA at Ida B. Wells Middle School in Washington, D.C. This is my 2nd year at the school, and I started using the pathways last school year in my classroom and have been able to elevate how I'm using it this year in the classroom.
And Logan, do you want to
Sorry, I was muted. My name is Logan Greene. I am currently in my 18th year in public education. I taught 14 years in the high school realm in urban, suburban, and rural schools, and I've spent the last 4 years teaching at a suburban middle school where I teach both ELA and social studies on a blended team. So I teach both courses and integrate writing in my social studies curriculum, as well as obviously my English class. And I will pass it over to my awesome colleague, Haley Ward.
Thank you, Logan. So I am Haley Ward. I teach, this is my 10th year teaching. I teach social studies. So I do a 7th grade civics and 7th grade geography. Both are semester long courses. And so I am on a team of math, science, language arts, and social studies teachers. So I am our social studies teacher for our team, but have been working with 7th grade now for the last 10 years. Most of my experience has been in suburban school systems. So
Thanks so much, guys. And Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Phil Weinberg. I get to work with Sherry on the writing pathway. I'm a long time, 15 years as an English teacher, 15 years as a high school principal in Brooklyn, and very excited to be here tonight and hear our colleagues talk about their use of the pathway.
Okay, so speaking of our purpose today, so the goal is that you get to hear from these educators and hear some really practical on-the-ground strategies for implementing the pathway, and really, the real deal on what that is like and what the struggles are, what the successes are. We'll also look a bit at student work, which we're excited about, and then we'll also close by talking about how do you build momentum for this work in your school or your district. As far as our flow here, we covered our welcome and intro. I'll give a bit of an introduction to the pathway for those of you that are not familiar with it yet. And then we'll spend most of our time on the panel discussion and wrap up with some time for Q&A. So I'm going to start here with some fairly depressing data, but I promise it will get better as we go. So we do have a real problem in this country, as you all probably know, when it comes to writing instruction. So 3 out of 4 8th graders in America are not proficient in writing. And those numbers get even worse when you look at students from low-income homes, 88% not proficient, students of color, 89% of students not proficient. So these numbers are pretty bleak. And we need to do better here. And if you're wondering if this data seems old, so this is data from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and it's the only nationally given assessment of writing. It was given last in 2011, which is quite a long time ago. But if we look at more recent data on reading and math, not a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone here, that those scores are down quite a bit. They've been down even before the pandemic, but post-pandemic even worse. And we know that writing scores are almost always lagging behind reading scores. So we can pretty safely assume that the writing scores now are either the same or more likely even worse than they were in 2011. So what is it that we're getting wrong when it comes to writing instruction? So there's a few things here, and I'm going to focus on zero in on a few of these. So first of all, it's just not happening nearly enough. And when it does, not terribly rigorous. Teachers are not prepared. So we expect teachers to teach writing, but they're not taught how to teach writing. And that is not an easy thing to do. It's also not happening across the curriculum. So one of the things that's really exciting about tonight is that we have two teachers here who teach social studies as well as ELA. And something that we think is really important and powerful is doing this work across the curriculum, not just in the ELA classroom. So this little meme needs to say, my English, social studies, science, economics, all those subjects teachers makes me read and write. The makes me is a little problematic, but the idea is that we need to see this happening across the curriculum. And the reason for that is that we know it's very, very clear from the research that when students write about what they're learning, they retain it better and they understand it better. So there's a real missed opportunity if we're not having students write in all content areas. We also have the issue of coherence. So some people are teaching hamburger buns, some teachers are teaching meal. There's all sorts of different ways we teach writing. None of these structures are bad in and of themselves. The problem is the incoherence, that students can go, even within one day, they can go from Ms. Ward's class to Mr. Greene's class and potentially have to learn a different way of writing, whoever that teacher is in front of them. And writing is already so challenging for students. It's such a heavy lift. To add to that load that they have to also learn this other way of doing it for this teacher and this teacher, it's just not a smart way of doing it and makes it just that much harder for them. And then this last one is about how we think about learning in general, but I think this applies particularly to writing, is that we tend to think that students need to be motivated, and then once they're motivated, they'll be successful, and that motivation will lead to success. But what we know, again, from research is that often it actually works the other way around, in that success and competence leads to motivation. So when you experience success and you know what you're doing, then you feel successful and you want to keep doing it. And we see this with reading instruction as well as with writing. And so we need to focus more on how do we build those skills so that students feel successful, and then the motivation often will come. So speaking of what we can do, these are 11 of the evidence-based recommendations for teaching writing. These are written by Dr. Steve Graham. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Steve Graham is considered by many to be the leader in the world of writing instruction research. We also happen to have the great privilege of having him as our research advisor. And Steve has been studying writing and writing instruction for many decades. He wrote back in 2007 a very impactful report called Writing Next. And just this year, 2024, Steve and his colleagues published a paper called Evidence-Based Recommendations for Teaching Writing, which has their updated 11 recommendations. And this is based on findings now from close to 1,000 different studies on writing. So I'd love to give folks a moment to just look through, because there's a lot here, look through those 11. Feel free to share in the chat any that particularly resonate with you, and think about what you would like to see more of in your classroom or in your school. Okay, so this research that Steve and his colleagues are summarizing is the same research that informed the development and the design of the writing pathway, along with regular input from teachers like the three you see here tonight. And we're really proud of what we've created together, and we're going to show you. So what is the writing pathway and how can it help? So I'm going to go to the pathway website at this point and walk you through what's here. So what is the writing pathway? It is an online scope and sequence for teaching writing. It can be used in any content area, grades 3 through 12. And when you come to the pathway, you'll see that it's organized into sentences and paragraphs and more. So at the sentences level, we have these two categories: basic sentence construction, your basic grammar, foundational skills, and then complex sentences. And this is one of my favorite spots. This is where you'll see the really high leverage, high impact sentence strategies that are going to teach your students how to write strong sentences, which are the foundation of all other writing, and assess and reinforce the content that you're teaching. And then we also have the paragraphs and more sections where we get into the process of writing, really guiding teachers and students through the process from, soup to nuts. All of these begin with having students study a mentor text so that they know where they're going and what success in that genre looks like. So we're going to look at just briefly one of these, because I do want to make sure we have time for our discussion. So we'll take a look here. We're in complex sentences. We're going to go to joining words. And as you can see, these are in a sequence. So you could feasibly start with number 1 if you don't know where to begin, or if you feel like your students have some proficiency already with some of these skills, you might want to start further down in the sequence. It's quite flexible. We've also just recently added this high priority label so that you can see what are the skills that if you have very little time, which we know many of you do, you can go right to those. So we're going to try one of those high priority skills right now, which is number 13 here, write with subordinating conjunctions, mixed practice, meaning that we've got all different kinds of subordinating conjunctions. So those are words like when, although, even though, after, etc. So when you get to the skill page, you'll see the summary of what the skill is. And then you'll see this worksheet. And this is a sample student worksheet. In this case, around content around a story about Pinky. And you'll see students get an example, and then they get their prompts. And in this case, they're getting a sentence stem with the subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the stem, which is really important because it's a written language structure. So whereas in our speech, we tend to use these subordinating conjunctions more in the middle of our sentences, in writing, it's really common for them to be at the beginning, which makes it more complex, harder to read, and harder to write. So we want to very explicitly have students practicing that skill. So you can see they're given that stem and then they're completing it. And when they complete it, not only are they practicing that sentence skill, but they have to show what they know about, in this case, about this text. You also get an answer key here, which is key as a teacher to be able to assess what students are producing. And then you also get some very general recommendations for instruction to have an idea of what this looks like in the classroom. So when I look at this, I see something that would have been enormously helpful just as a model to me as a teacher, but where it gets really exciting is when you come over here. So I can come over here and say, I'm teaching the, Birch Bark House, and we just finished chapter 3, and this is 6th grade. And I can click that generate materials button and off it will go. While it does that, I'll call out a few features here. So notice you also have an option to upload. So if you have a text or a handout that you've used that you want to have the AI pull from, you can upload it right here and it will pull directly. We also have the option for translation. I'll show you in a moment. And here's our new worksheet. So same instructions now, but now it's in the content that my students are learning. So we're learning about Omakayas in the Birch Bark House, and now we have sentences related to that. And you can see those here. I'll just scroll down a little bit so you can see that we have the answer key as well. And as I said, I can translate this into any language. So if I click Spanish, it will do that same worksheet in Spanish. I also can export what I create to Google Docs or print it or save it as a PDF. And I can also edit it right here on the screen. So once the purple dots finish, you'll be able to see how that editing can work. So for example, although now it's in Spanish, and I don't speak Spanish, but you can come right in here and I've gotten so impatient now with AI. Okay, so we can delete this. We can make any changes that we need to make. Okay, so let me go back to our slides here. So before we move to the panel discussion, I just want to briefly talk about impact because it's really, really important. So you can probably see that the pathway is trying to address the problems that we talked about. And you can see how it's based on the evidence and what we know works. But we still have the question of, does this thing work? Does the pathway work? Does this particular combination and platform move the needle? So it's not enough to just have an approach that's based on the research. We also need to test that approach. So that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years with over 100 students across the country. Sorry, 1,000 students, not 100, across the country. And here's what we're finding. So our 23-24, sorry, did I get that? Yeah, 23-24 school year study was with 441 middle school students, many of the students in these teachers' classrooms on the call. And those students improved by 2.5 points on a test of persuasive writing. And we did a pre and a post test with an effect size of 0.64. And that's considered a moderate effect size, which is pretty amazing for a writing intervention at the middle school level. And another way to think about this is that students in the treatment group receiving the pathway made a 25th percentile gain. So if they had come in at a 50th percentile level, they left at a 75th percentile level, if you want to think about what that looks like. So we're pretty excited about these outcomes. And with that, I will transition us to our panel discussion with these fabulous educators. So we're going to start this section focusing on getting started with the pathway. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. And my first question is hopefully a simple one. What drew you to this work, to trying the writing pathway in your classroom? And we'll start with, who did I say would go first? Logan, would you mind going first?
Sure, I am more than happy to go first. So in my 14 years in the high school level, I spent a lot of time teaching in the AP classroom, which is built upon writing. And something I saw throughout that is that students could grasp the ideas and the themes and the content. What they actually struggled with were the bones of writing, the sentence level construction and those issues that at the high school level, a lot of high school teachers take for granted. So when coming to the middle school level and starting to teach writing, I really wanted to focus on that. And at the same time, I was offered the opportunity to work with the writing pathway, and it has been a blessing because to me, I put in the chat, that is the biggest gap we're seeing is that students are not, it's not that they're not capable of writing essays like a lot of times we think, it's that they are missing the framework of how to write at the sentence level and then move that on. And we try to rush, I say, if writing process is an A, B, C, D, E, we try to, especially at the high school level, expect them to go to D and E, and we forget about A, B, and C. And what I love about the pathway is it implements every step of that, and it gives you options to work on all of that. So in a classroom, you can be focusing on the bones, but if you have students who are a little higher level, you can have them focusing on other things as well. And it's absolutely wonderful. And even the high level students, they need that reinforcement on the sentence level. So I think that's really big. And I will be quiet now and pass it over to someone.
No, I just want to echo. I love that last point you made, Logan, because I think I taught high school as well. And I think we often at the high school level think sentences is so babyish, like we're past that. And what we forget is that when you're learning something new, if you were asked to write a sentence about, like any of us, right? If I was asked to write a sentence about cricket, a sport of which I know nothing about, one single sentence about cricket would be very challenging for me because I know nothing about that content. So it can really be quite rigorous when there's new content. So I love that point. Let's pass it to Laura. What drew you to the writing pathway?
Yeah, the writing pathway, the first time I had an opportunity to dive in was kind of the before when we were trying to understand what teachers were doing. And I was at a charter school at the time in DC, and I was learning from amazing teachers who have been teaching for years and years and years, the wonderful ways that they have always taught students to write. But what I found was that they always had really great strategies and keys for high students, but for lower students, it was always a struggle to simplify down the basics of how to help them with their writing. And like Logan said, a lot of that is that sentence-based writing. And so I found that the pathway has really helped me to be able to differentiate and meet kids where they're at with a lot of that simple writing that, like he said, that high school teachers take for granted. I think even now in my classroom, now working in the public school system in DC, there are very, 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 very few things that are provided to me as a gen ed teacher to support my English language learners and my students with IEPs. So I have found that the writing pathways is a really low lift place for me to find immediate ways to support those students while also being able to reach the students who are on grade level.
Yeah, so I can sort of echo what both Logan and Laura have mentioned. So I have all of my experience teaching so far in the years I've been in a classroom has been either 7th or 8th grade. And so for me as a middle school teacher, when I first started teaching, wanted to think about kind of course, teaching my course of study, but then think about the skill set that students would need to have in writing, like once they move, as they go through middle school, and then when they move into high school, for those kids that are going to be taking like pre-AP and AP classes. And so I have always, kind of really since I started teaching, looked for ways to incorporate writing within my content area, within both civics and with geography, also world history when I taught world history. But one thing that I noticed, a lot of kids could give me really good ideas for things and they could find evidence and they could talk about the evidence, but just some of the basic like sentence construction pieces were missing. And so I'm not an English teacher. I don't, have grammar standards that I'm supposed to cover. And so for me, the pathway just was super appealing because there are so many times where I would be teaching and I would need just like a quick like sentence construction or grammar type of lesson where I could just show them, or show them an exemplary example of something, but just not having really the resources of, like I said, as a social studies teacher, to do that. And then having to go, and it would just take so much time to have to go and try to find and dig through resources. And so once I was introduced to the pathway, I realized it made everything much more streamlined where I could say, okay, my students are struggling with this type of sentence construction. Let me find a pathway lesson, and then I was able to easily implement it. So for me, I think, like I said, I would notice gaps in my students' writing. And so I have always looked for ways to try to fill in those gaps with resources.
Thanks, Haley. So this question I hope follows. I'm curious if there were certain skills, and you guys have all mentioned sentences, were there certain skills that you found yourself gravitating towards in particular or particularly impactful in your work with the pathway? And you can just go ahead, Logan, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I hate to be repetitive, but going back to the sentence construction, because what I found when working with the pathway, what worked best for me was starting every class with the pathway as a way to kickstart the class. And that answered one of the things we saw before in the research of writing every day. And I think sometimes teachers get very overwhelmed with the thought of writing every day because we think of writing every day as, oh, we've got to write a paragraph or we've got to write an essay. No, writing every day can be 2 sentences at the start of class, but there's specific sentences where we're working with subordinating conjunctions, or we're working with combining 2 sentences, or we're working on a complex sentence, whatever it is. So to me, the pathway allows me to start class with something writing, but something very skill focused, because that's the other thing that we have to remember is sometimes we get lost in our content and we forget our skill focus. And to me, the pathway answers that possibility. And then with the AI tool, you can merge the two. So I can go in and I can make the content about world history because I actually use the pathway. This is something I tell people that shocks them. I teach both history and English. I actually right now use the pathway more in my history class because I'm able to match it up with the content in a beautiful way. And as I joke, I'm working on English skills and the kids don't realize they're working on English skills. So it's kind of a sneak in there. So I think that's really it. But at the same time, the paragraph skill work is so important as well, because that's really great for the kids to see that. Today, for instance, we're wrapping up our unit on Frankenstein, and my kids are writing analytical paragraphs, and I pulled a writing pathway lesson today to kind of get that started with them. So it's really those ones getting away from this idea that writing has to be this huge final essay product. It can be, and you can start halfway through you can stop halfway through the writing process with the pathway, and it's still an absolutely wonderful and valuable lesson. So I think that's what really draws me to it skill-wise as far as that goes. I know that was a little vague, but that's really what it hits with me.
No, that was perfect. And you know what? I'm looking at our time, and I think we're going to transition to the student work. And Logan, if you don't mind, I know you're probably tired now, but I'd love you to talk through the sample that you shared with us. So let me just share my screen. And if you want to give any context, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So first of all, this is obviously a rather large sample, so I apologize, but this is from last year. Last year, I was teaching on a team with 130 students, which was a lot of students. We were in a situation last year where we were between 3 teams and 4 teams, and unfortunately, due to units, we had to back down to 3 teams. I'm sure teachers in the room can understand that. So the writing pathway was really a godsend to me because it allowed me to really integrate this writing into my instruction in a beautiful way. And this is a response from after we had read The Outsiders, we watched the film. Students were very excited about that. And then I burst their bubble by explaining to them that they were going to have to give me some analysis of the film afterwards. And this is a beautiful response written by a young lady who was actually off grade level at the beginning of the year. And by the end of the year, she was actually above grade level. And I think the writing pathway was a part of that. And she wrote this. And again, going back to my big point about bones here, I'm not really looking, I did not pick this particular one due to the overall paragraph. I picked it because as you read through it and you look at the sentences, she's writing complex sentences with really beautiful transitions, really beautiful intros and everything. So we see there where she starts out, I believe that the film version, The Outsiders, is a bad representation of the book because of the several differences inside of the movie, along with many cutouts of important scenes throughout the film. For instance, you know, she's getting these transitions. And that goes back to the sentence construction. Instead of trying to explain to them in this huge paragraph, overwhelming way, when we broke it down into sentences, this is really big. And then we go down there during this time, Ponyboy was supposed to ask for dairy in his days and say that he killed Bob, along with saying that. These are complex sentences that 8th graders are writing that is just, it really shows that when you break it down into pieces and then build it up from there, they can then construct this paragraph without even realizing it. And then you get into the argumentation side. This scene is very important because it shows how the bond between Ponyboy and Derry is stronger, and this shows Ponyboy how much Derry truly cares for him. That's multi-layered analysis. And to see that is just absolutely heartwarming as a teacher, and especially with the student who at the beginning of the year was not quite there, but by the end of the year was really flourishing.
That was
And again,
wonderful. I feel like we should stop there. Yes, that was so lovely, Logan. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, and the only thing I was going to say is, and what I do like about this assignment, this shows the integration of the pathway from the sentence construction side all the way through the paragraph side. Not all the way to the essay side, but through the paragraph side, really integrating those lessons into one kind of complete package.
Yes, yes. And I'm just looking at it. I'm seeing even there's a positive in here. But they don't show the letter he received from Sandy, comma, his girlfriend, that was shown in the book, embedded at the end of a sentence, which is quite complex. Transitions galore. Also, the way that the student gives context, like I was very impressed by. I'm sure my English teachers out there will know, like, it's really hard to get kids to give enough context for the evidence that they're giving to make sense. And the way that she says, where was it? For instance, during the hospital scene, when Derry and Soda Pop come to visit Ponyboy, also using a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the clause there. So there's just so much in here. It's really.
And the last thing I'll add in that I remembered is this was another big part of the writing pathway that I love is our students don't want to revise. They see revise as like something that is poisonous to them. And the pathway pushes us to remember to always try and convince our students to revise. And this was a revision, but it was also a revision under a class time restraint. So they couldn't go home and AI this. They couldn't go home and really sit down for 2 hours and work on this. They had about 30 minutes to revise their original draft and really break it down and work on it. And this is what we got, which I was incredibly pleased with this response. So I think that's another side of the pathway where you see those revision lessons, which is huge, convincing kids, hey, this is part of the process and don't forget to do it.
Yeah, and I think it gets at the importance of valuing process over product. I was talking to an educator earlier today talking about how they had a sibling who their writing instruction was it was always about product. And what was the product of that? They hated writing. Writing was just this thing that you had to do to check a box, as opposed to really seeing it as a way to discover and understand what we're learning. So I love that. Okay, we're gonna go to our other student samples and then we'll wrap up our discussion. So Laura, would you mind going next with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Building on a lot of the stuff that Logan mentioned about the pathways, I think one of my favorite things that I have discovered through the pathway that really has helped me and my students is using exemplars. And so a lot of times if the district provides any exemplar, it's above their writing level. So the part that I really do appreciate about the pathways is that the exemplars provided are at the student's writing level. So as if an 8th grader was writing this paragraph, this essay. Again, I struggle with not every time we sit down, we have to write the entire essay. And so specifically with this lesson that is on the screen here about counter arguments, students in 7th grade are already spending time based on Common Core standards writing argumentative essays. So from the jump, when I want to take the time to model the most important thing, I was able to use the pathways to create an exemplar of an entire student essay and then remove the paragraph that I wanted to focus on. So I removed the counter argument paragraph because in 7th grade, the standard says to acknowledge the counterclaim, but in 8th grade, the standard then progresses to say distinguish claims from opposing views. So students already know that they need to state a counterclaim, but the growth point for 8th grade was now we have to distinguish how it is different from all of the other views. So before they read this student response that's on the screen, they read one that was complete, including the counter argument. We went through the counter argument paragraph and we identified the 4 sentences and the purpose of each of the 4 sentences. So on their practice section here for that paragraph number 3, you see that it has each of those sentences and the description that the students had written. So we have counterclaims saying that it's a contrasting viewpoint presented, as well as the evidence, the reasoning, and and the rebuttal being the main thing that was new to 8th grade students. And so students were able to use this guide to create one single paragraph. When they then at the end of the unit wrote their own entire argumentative essay, they did an amazing job at making sure they had those 4 sentences in their counterclaim and making it different from what their 7th grade argumentative writing is. Of course, we then focused on the other paragraphs that are needed in the argumentative essay at a separate time. However, first wanted to talk about the difference, because students often were like, oh, well, I already know how to do argumentative writing. I did it last year. And I was like, you did, but we're going to make it 8th grade level. We're going to make it more complex. So I think this really helped them to notice the difference. The other thing that I was able to do with this especially is because I already had that model paragraph that I took away, I was able to provide sentence stems for students for each of these 4 different parts of the paragraph. So students who are English language learners, or students who have an IEP, disabilities, or even students who we have not identified in any way, but the data has shown us like, hey, they really need that sentence level support. I was able to put in some sentence stem in there, or multiple choice the evidence, or, have them work with a partner, have them in very intentional groupings, so that they could discuss their answers out loud before writing them down. And I don't know how I ever wrote so many exemplars before the writing pathways, because the amount of time that it takes, I know every single teacher person who's been in a school knows it takes forever to write an exemplar. And so a lot of times I strayed from using exemplars in class because it would just take so much time on my end. This has made it so much quicker, and I'm able to go back in and edit some of the other things. So one of the words in this, one of the paragraphs was a word that we had been practicing in class, which was imperative. It was one of our vocabulary words. So I went back in and I found a place to put imperative, or I switched out. Yes, it is imperative, because we have been working on that word and getting students to up their vocabulary. So I was able to go in and edit what the pathways had given me to make sure I was also hitting the target vocabulary that we had been talking about in class.
Amazing. Thanks, Laura. I was trying to highlight it, but I don't think I can. But yes, I love that idea of really customizing it. Like it's saving you the time and then being able to go in and highlight your specific vocabulary that you've been using in your classroom. And I also really love the way that this chunks, it strikes me like contrast this to what I'm sure many of us have done, which is here's an assignment for an argumentative essay. Good luck. Or maybe here's an outline. Good luck, right? Contrast that with this, where it's really focused, really chunked. We're going to really figure out how to do that counterclaim paragraph and piece by piece put this all together into a whole. Last one. Let's talk about geography, Haley.
Hey, thank you. So this is basically so I teach geography. It's a semester-long course. And one thing I do, this is like very beginning of the semester, I will ask students what they think geography is and what they think it kind of entails, like what geographers do. And so I immediately, as soon as we start geography, we'll start building on the knowledge base that they have. Because of course their answers are always very concrete, like geography is, maps and capitals and things like that. And so what we do at this is like second day that we do geography. I give them a page of text, and it just essentially talks about geography, the work of geographers. And so I created a very simple kind of short writing assignment off of that. And I basically, we read the text, talked about it, and then I basically gave students the prompt. I said, okay, like what is geography? And then ultimately, like, why is it important? And so there were a couple things that I wanted to focus on. Of course, I wanted to do the content, but one thing that I've really worked on, and I mentioned this earlier, is just seeing a need for helping them with complex sentences. A lot of my students struggle with, they have these ideas, but they don't know how to transition sentence to sentence where it flows, where it's not choppy, and where it's just kind of fragmented. So I worked on, really wanted to focus on complex sentences. And then of course, the part of the pathway where it talks about like writing to inform. So one of the things I work with them on is we do a lot of persuasive writing, but then there are times where I say, okay, like, for this, we're not necessarily, we want to be convincing, but I want this to be informative, where we talk about, okay, like what is geography? Like, why does it ultimately matter. And so, but I feel like the two kind of things I really focused on complex sentence structure for this particular lesson, and then just some of the basic complex sentences and then basic sentence construction. One thing that I'll also mention too, we have at our school, we have 23 different languages represented in 32 countries. And so one thing that the pathway made it much easier for me to be able to do is for students I have that are learning English, it made it much easier to be able to tailor this assignment kind of to their level. I was able to tailor their lessons, like I said, is they're learning English. So that was super helpful. And then another thing too is just like Laura mentioned, creating exemplars. I think every educator knows create exemplars are good practice. That's what we're supposed to do. But just with the amount of time constraints that we have, it's just they're time consuming, and we just don't always have time. And so what I did before I had students write anything, I'll back up for a second. I created a similar prompt and used the pathway to generate exemplars so they could get an idea of sort of like what I was looking for, and created it on a 7th grade level. That way, like I said, because sometimes I know in a lot of my curriculum materials, the exemplars that I do have are way above a middle school level. So it's just not helpful. But yes, I focused heavily on the kids writing complex sentences and the sentence construction lessons before doing that before they wrote this piece. So we read about it. I did some of the pathway lessons, and then I had them construct a short response.
And it shows. I mean, you see the conjunctions, because you see the transitions. I mean, it's all over there. So very, very.
And I think honestly, like Logan was saying, I know I have certainly been guilty of this as an educator. Like a lot of times we think of writing instruction as or just writing where it has to be this big, massive sort of research paper writing assignment, very long. And it's just not the case. I mean, I was able to use a couple of the sentence construction lessons, and they were able to produce this. I mean, they weren't perfect, but I saw a lot of just improvement in the way that kids structured sentences, and also has helped with building their writing endurance. I know, like a lot of times with 7th graders, they'll write like 3 or 4 sentences and say, okay, I wrote something, I'm done, I don't need to expand anymore or say anymore. And so the pathway has definitely helped kind of helped me develop writing endurance in my students, where I don't even think they have necessarily realized it. So
I love that. Yeah. And I think also, I mean, the research supports this chunking. Like the more that kids can have more at bats, quick practice, quick feedback, quick cycles of that's how they get better. So it makes total sense. It's not having them write, a 5-page essay every night. It's this focused instruction. Okay. So thanks so much for sharing your students' work with us. And we're going to talk a little bit about getting this going in a school or a district. So I'm curious how you have found other teachers that you've shared the pathway with. Maybe I'll start with, what are you sharing with them? What do you share with them when you talk to them? And how do you find their response to it? And anyone can go on that one.
I don't mind to pop in first. Actually, like 2 or 3 weeks ago now, we had a department meeting, ELA, whole school, and the task was to read some like different type of resource books that teachers would have about sentence construction, and finding ways that we can integrate those into an upcoming lesson, whether that's for EL students or whether that's for all students, finding ways that we can start introducing that. And so my group was assigned subordinating conjunctions, and we talked about it and we read about it, and we were like, oh, this is so great. What ideas do you have? Oh, let's do it on this day, this lesson. Like, it'll be the do now. They'll review what they read the last day using subordinating conjunctions. They have to write a summary. And so I was like, great, cool. And everyone's like, great, let's write some sentences. And I was like, okay, just give me 1 second. And I pulled up the pathways on another tab, and I typed in exactly everything we had discussed, and I hit generate, and it came up with a worksheet, and I shared it, and I was like, great, here we go. Like, this is the worksheet. And they were like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. And I was like, yeah, there's this thing called the writing pathways, and it basically will do exactly what we've been talking about for us. And they were like, there's no way. And I was like, yes, there is a way. And I did not have to use my brain at all. We just had to come up with a plan about what exactly we wanted to focus on. and then put it in the pathways, and it made the entire worksheet. And all of the teachers were like, wow, this is great. And I was like, exactly. It took me, what, 2 seconds to type in, what section of A Raised in the Sun we were reading and what exact character we wanted to focus on. And then we copy and pasted it. And then I can copy and paste just the parts I want into my daily work because I have my do now connected to the mini lesson and then the work itself. So just copied it straight from the pathways and pasted it into the Word doc where I already had the work done for the day. So that's how I've kind of been showing my not classmates, my coworkers, because just by doing it and being like, yeah, so this is it. Because I think a lot of teachers are scared to use AI in the planning purposes. They're like, oh, but I need to go through the process. Like I need to internalize the lesson. I need to understand it. And I'm right there with you. Like, absolutely, we do. But there are tools that we can use with AI that can help us do like the exemplar writing, the stuff that takes that time with the time constraints that we have. Sometimes it's so nice to have an AI like the writing pathways that can just spit out exactly what we need without us having to go through the process of creating it ourselves.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Go ahead, Phil.
Just want to modify one sentence that Laura said. Said, I did not have to use my brain at all. And I would argue that what happened instead was a group of teachers used their brains on the things that matter so they could build something better for their students. And why did you have to sit there and write those sentences once you knew what you needed to do? It seems like an exemplary use of the pathway, and I'm thrilled to hear about it.
And I was just to echo like the fear around AI. I mean, I just recently saw an article about how teachers are reporting using AI even less now than they were like 6 months ago, which is interesting. And I think there's a lot of hesitation, a lot of fear, and a lot of it warranted. And one of the things I love about the pathway is that its AI is teacher facing. So like to Phil's point and to your point, this is a tool to support teachers who have enough to do, my God, right? To take a little bit off their plate so that they can focus on the things that have the biggest impact, on really knowing your students and what they need, as opposed to writing sentences about A Raisin in the Sun. Like that is something that we can offload here to the AI incredibly, and free teachers up to do what they're really good at and what only humans can do. So yeah, I love that piece of it. Okay, looking at our time, let's do one more question and then we will open it up to our audience. And I just have to find my questions. Where'd they go? Okay. Yeah. So here's a question. So what is your tip? Let's say you have a teacher talking to you who says like, yeah, I'm interested. It's cool, but I'm a little overwhelmed. There's a lot there. I already have a lot to cover and a lot to do. What would you say to that teacher?
I can chime in a little bit on that. So I feel like kind of like I said, and I'm looking at it from a social studies background. A lot of social studies teachers will, they know they need to incorporate writing. I mean, writing certainly lends it. I mean, writing is such a huge part, honestly, of all of the social science disciplines. But I guess kind of just number one, as you mentioned, like the time constraints of like having enough time. And so one thing that I kind of struggled with in the early days of my career is I would have this mindset that like if I couldn't do writing strategies, couldn't do so many and couldn't do them exactly a certain way, then I just, maybe that I was like failing as a social studies teacher. But what I've learned kind of with the pathway, and this has really changed my thinking on like how I teach writing instruction, is my advice would be to just pick, one or two just pick a few things that you feel like your students need additional instruction on or need help with. Think about the gaps that you are trying to fill in for your students as a whole. And then if you have, students that are learning English or maybe students that are struggling readers, like think about the gaps that you want to fill in with your students and focus just on those things. You certainly don't have to try to cover every single part of the pathway. Like I said, I've learned over time to just choose a few things or a few lessons where I know that we need work. I know we need to focus on, and that's what I focus on. And if there's something else that we don't have time to get to, then that's, we don't have time to get to it. Like Logan was saying, I mean, you can do writing instruction and it be just a couple of sentences. It doesn't have to be, just a really long research paper or a long essay or, the 5-paragraph essay. I know it's infamous as it is sometimes, or as it can be, or as it's thought about. But like I said, I think just maybe picking, kind of think about what your students need and what they what they need, and then look to fill those gaps. And you can certainly use the pathway to do that.
Yeah, and I think echoing what Haley was saying, I was having a discussion with one of our administrators recently about how do we essentially that big question in education, how do we go from good to great, and how do we get those last 5 points we want on these assessments? How do we do that? And I told her it is my firm belief that when it comes to literacy and writing, that social studies and science are the places where we can make those gains a lot faster than most people think. And the writing pathway is just such a key component of that, because for social studies and science teachers who may be nervous about integrating writing into their classrooms, they can pick very specific skills with their English department and say, hey, we're going to take this weight off you and we're going to focus on this in our classroom. And the writing pathway gives them ready-made strategies and skills that they can integrate in their classroom in really easy ways, through bell ringers, through small activities, through add-on things to assignments they're already doing. And the nice thing is you're not forcing these teachers to have to go learn some huge new curriculum or some new skill set or something that is overwhelming to them, that's going to add stress to them. It's something that's going to make their life easier while also giving them a more fully fleshed out curriculum. So I think that's where we really see that ability to grab teachers who may be hesitant to do this, and where we can really see those gains with writing and literacy.
So we can open it up to questions. Folks in the webinar, if you want to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, either one works. I also have pulled up the questions that were sent in ahead. So when folks registered, we asked them for their questions. So we can start with those. So one of the questions there was, let's see, how are you delivering the content to students? What is the workflow that you've found most efficient?
I can start with that. As I said, every day in my history classroom, the start of class is a writing pathway skill. So just to give you an idea, yesterday, and I can pull it up right now, yesterday my students came in and we are wrapping up ancient Greece. Their writing pathways start with the class was for 5 minutes. It was students will link two related sentences with an appropriate similarity transition, word or phrase, similarly or likewise. And I told them write 2 sentences about Greek city-states using a similarity transition. So boom, right there. It's simple, it's clean. And then we had students share their answers. And what I like is this organically happens. We'll get sentences that are good, but then students will say, hey, how about we do this? And it improves the sentence. And that's beautiful group learning. That's very quick workflow that doesn't require me sitting there and grading for an hour.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? We have others. Okay. So this question, I don't know if anyone here wants to take, I can try if you don't. Please provide tips for world language teachers.
I will say that in my school, part of the thing that impacts everybody's evaluations is writing. So no matter if you are a PE teacher or you are an ELA teacher or a world language teacher, writing impacts your evaluation. And so one thing that we have been working on as a school, and I'm hoping that we can continue to incorporate the pathways in this as well, is providing similar language that we're using across content. So my school has decided on CER to be the acronym that we use to create paragraph writing. So no matter if you're in PE or science or math, you are writing a CER in order to create your paragraphs. So no matter what you're using, no matter what content you're using, and this is the last, the comment I just put into the chat as well. I often, when I go into a social studies classrooms or even to the PE classrooms, I notice that teachers are trying to come up with their own way to teach writing because there is just not one standard way to teach writing. And the pathways has really helped to create that consistency across the content, across the grade levels. And so as a world language teacher, I think it would be a wonderful way to do the things that Logan was mentioning in the do nows. Have it using transition words, compound sentences, sentence combining, appositives, anything like that could be in. No matter the language that students are writing in, they still need those basic skills because they apply no matter what language it is. And with our students in our school in general, as I said, writing scores impact everyone. So it is best for everyone to have a consistent way to approach writing, and writing pathways truly provides that for everyone. That is like a great starting point, because I know like PE teachers often in my school are concerned about, how do I teach writing? Like I did not learn how to do this ever. And I'm like, pathways. Here we go. I'll give this to you. You can type in your health. You know, they did a tennis one recently, like whatever it is that you're learning about, you can just type it right on in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Laura. And it makes me think too of your reference to what Logan was saying, that if you teach, like, let's say you teach Italian, right? You could go to the pathway, thanks to the AI, you could put in content that maybe they're working on, Logan, what was the content? Greek,
Ancient Greek city-states.
right. So they could put ancient Greek city-states, but then do it in Italian, right? Like,
Mhm.
think about, now you're like, that's like three things at the same time. So they're working on the content for social studies, the language, and the sentence structure. I mean, it's just so neat. Okay, so we are almost at the close here. I think.
There's a wonderful question in the chat about
Oh.
Jessica wrote asking whether we can talk about how you can use the pathway to enhance students' fiction writing in a way that's not formulaic. I don't know if either of the three of you would like to handle that.
Yeah, I can, as the only ELA teacher. So we're actually just finishing up our narrative unit right now, which we read A Raisin in the Sun. And so their task was to write a new scene for A Raisin in the Sun, keeping consistent with the characterization that had happened throughout the entire text. And so while the narrative writing on the fiction sections don't necessarily have the AI generative material, it does provide lessons. So the thing that I used the most from the narrative writing was one of the things at the beginning, which is like the planning, the organizing section, because like you're saying, Jessica, like I have very little instruction as an ELA teacher on that fiction writing. And so that was a great place for me to get started, because my team was debating back and forth, what kind of graphic organizer should we use for a narrative? What kind of sentence stem should we provide for narrative? Like, what direction do we want to go in with the narrative? And I went to the pathways and I pulled their organization structure, and we used that to kind of help get kids started. So they kind of helping kids start with the end in mind when they're writing a narrative. And then on the flip side, at the end, we now have we're just finishing. We're actually about to do this tomorrow. And there's a goal setting section on the pathways. And so I've kind of turned the goal setting section and I've combined it with the rubric that was provided to us and created like a checklist for students to go through tomorrow. So tomorrow they'll go through, and it's right here next to me. They have to, it says you have descriptive imagery, show, not tell. So part of that is on the checklist that I provided for them. They have to then write a sentence example from their narrative. So kind of taking what the Pathways has provided to create my own materials as a starting point, because for a lot of the fiction writing, I don't have a starting point on what to do. And so that has really helped me with that side of the writing.
Yeah, and just to echo, I consider narrative writing to be my biggest weakness as an ELA teacher. It's just not something I'm comfortable with. I'm an informational text guy. But we had a little short story called The Brave Little Toaster, which is beloved in Alabama middle school. It's not the movie, and if you put it into AI automatically thinks it's the movie, and it's hilarious. However, that's a great way to catch students who use AI early in the year, because their stuff will be about the movie. However, I used the fictional narrative one and like the storyboard lesson. It's a great way to look at it. And then I pick specific sentence construction lessons to do as the do-nows for that week. And then that kind of helps students kind of get a good kickoff there, because as you said, Jessica, I love what you said about try to not have it be formulaic. I think that's such a wise thing. We don't want formulaic writing. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in the AP world somewhat with the new rubrics, and it's actually harming things. And I think that's something we definitely have to be wary of for sure.
I think it's a wonderful end to the conversation, because the one thing we often forget, and I did as an English teacher as well, about teaching fiction writing, is the basis of it is well-constructed variety of sentences that can communicate meaning and feeling, which is probably even harder if you're not able to write complex sentences. So thank you guys, all of you, for bringing that up for folks. And thank you, Jessica, for the great question.
And my daughter, who is visiting with us, wants to know what's narrative. So it's a good question for her. So I just pasted into the chat a whole bunch of resources. So there is a link to, thank you, Logan. There's a link to a survey about today's webinar. We'd love your feedback on that. There's a link to a Padlet where we're collecting questions and feedback on the pathway. There's some really good stuff in there, just if you want to see what other teachers are saying about the pathway, and feel free to add as well. The one-pager links didn't work, so I'll put those in a second. The website, and then all of our emails. All of these teachers have graciously offered to share their emails, so you can reach out to any of them. They're obviously fantastic, as you can see. And yeah, it's all there, and we have a few minutes left to spare. Thank you so much, the three of you. We really appreciate this. I'm sure I can speak for the audience that this was so valuable. So thank you so much. And that's it. Have a great night, all.